Alvin York, a man that very few know about, but with a story that has changed the lives of thousands, if not millions of people across the nation and around the world. A war hero, an educator, an activist, and a man that anybody would have the pleasure to meet. Today we will go over how one man with a poor background became, by definition, one of the most humble heroes of the 20th century. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alvin was born on December 13, 1887 in the very rural county of Fentress, Tennessee. He was the third eldest child out of 11 who were all born in a two-room cabin on a 70-acre plot of partially infertile land. Their mother Mary was a homemaker, and their father William worked as a blacksmith to supplement their income. William and Mary were very good to their children and always parented with discipline and morality. This caused the children to respect and admire their parents. Alvin in particular was very close to his father and would always go hunting and target shooting with him. The wisdom and instruction of his father taught York to be an excellent hunter and marksman of many different kinds of game. When the children were able to, they began to go to school 3 months a year, but unfortunately that didn't last very long. After only reaching the 3rd grade, they were needed back on the farm just like most children in the area. However, this didn't keep Alvin from learning to read as he enjoyed books on his downtime. He would often read books about Jesse James or other historic outlaws. These stories fantasized action into his life. And in an attempt to mimic these outlaws, he would often gallop around on horseback with his revolver, utilizing the trees as targets. This envy of an action-filled life led Alvin to run with a bad crowd at his new railway job. He began to drink heavily, gamble away all his wages, stay out all night, and get into fights. In the year of 1911, at the age of 24, York would lose his father. This loss didn't seem to affect Alvin at all, but if it did, he was already drowning himself in booze anyways, so it's not like you could tell. When William passed, Alvin's mother Mary began to continually plead with him to quit his way of life and be a better boy. A few years later in 1915, Mary waited all night to confront York about his evening escapades. After a short back and forth, Mary asked him, "Alvin, when are you going to be a man like your father and grandfathers?" This question deeply affected Alvin, and that night he promised his mother that he would make a full turnaround. However, it is worth noting at this time in York's life, he began to hunt more often and found himself in the yard of Gracie Williams. And in the opinion of York's mother, it was most likely that Gracie played a role in Alvin's change. As he turned away from his previous actions, he began to once more go to church and begin to seriously help his family. York became passionate only for God, his family, and Gracie. Alvin became heavily involved in the church. He even began conducting and leading his church choir, and as time went on, he developed a strong friendship with Reverend Pyle. While York's life was changing for the better, on the other side of the world there was a war raging on in Europe. And as America attempted to remain neutral, they were nevertheless dragged into the First World War in April of 1917. As young Americans were rapidly dying in a foreign land due to poor and repetitive tactics, unable to withstand against new technologies, back home in the US, the recruitment became desperate. President Woodrow Wilson instituted a nationwide draft on June 5th, which unfortunately for York was just 3 days after he asked Gracie to marry him. Eventually, Alvin's number was punched, and on November 14th, York went down to Jamestown to report for his final medical board. While Alvin was awaiting orders for basic training, he was having an internal struggle with himself. On one hand, he wanted to be a good American for his country, but on the other hand, he also didn't want to commit murder and disobey God. After 2 days of praying and asking God for guidance, his prayers were answered. In York's own words,
"I received my assurance that it was all right, that I should go, and that I would come back without a scratch. I received this assurance direct from God."
With his new confidence in God's plan and not his own, York went off to Camp Gordon on November 17, 1917. Shortly into York's basic training, he received a letter from his mother, and inside was paperwork from Reverend Pyle that would claim York as a conscientious objector and get him out of his military service. All York had to do was sign, but he refused this ticket out and trusted the plan. In January of 1918, York finished basic training and was assigned to the newly formed Golf Company, 2nd Battalion, 328th Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Division. This division was special in that when it was formed it had Americans from every single state across the nation. This is why they were named the All-American Division and wore the still iconic AA patch. On May 1st, York and the rest of Golf Company set sail from Boston, and after a short stop in England, they reached Le Havre, France on the 21st. But before heading to the front, the 328th Regiment would be attached to the reserve British unit 40 miles behind the front lines at the Somme. Here the men were cross-trained in all manner of British weapons from rifles to grenades, in preparation to reinforce the front lines as the Allies expected a large German counteroffensive. Fortunately, the attack never came, and the 328th were reassigned back under U.S. authority. As June 27th rolled around, the 82nd Division would be ordered to relieve the 26th Division at Rambouillet, and this would be the first time York would experience the front lines. In his own words,
It was a quiet sector where they put new troops to train them before sending them out into no man's land. I was out in no man's land, and I did a right smart piece of patrolling handling an automatic squad.
although this piece of the front was relatively quiet, it still had its fair share of dangers such as shelling, snipers, and the occasional gas attack. On July 25th, the 82nd Division would be relieved and sent to Pont-à-Mousson for preparation of the Battle of St. Mihiel. Here on September 12th, York and the rest of Golf Company would be thrown into the full weight of combat. At 1:15 a.m., the Allied barrage would begin to shell the German lines for over 4 hours, until daybreak arrived and the men were ordered over the top. They were met with ferocious resistance across the 20-kilometer front. Ahead of Golf Company laid 5 lines of defensive trench systems equipped with machine gun nests and concrete fortifications, all preluded by row upon row of barbed wire and incoming artillery fire. Golf Company was eager to break the monotony and fight the Germans. Their drive to push the enemy back became so fast-paced that they managed to push 2 kilometers behind enemy lines on the first day. York wrote,
We lost a lot of our men because they were so anxious to get the enemy that they kept pushing forward. We continued through Norroy onto the top of the hill beyond until we got in advance of our own flank, and the Germans were enfilading our right flank and shooting at us from the rear.
It wasn't until the afternoon of the 13th that the rest of the battalion caught up with them at Norroy. From this position, the 2nd Battalion was being shelled not only from their front, but also from the fortified city of Metz to their right flank. York wrote,
The Germans threw a lot of gas shells into Norroy, and we had to wear our gas masks for several hours. Many of the boys were gassed or killed. Seeing the boys all shut up, gassed, blown to pieces, and killed lying about us, there is no tongue or human being who can ever tell the feeling of a man during this time. But I never doubted in the thickest of battle that God would bring me through safe.
For the next 4 days, York and his men would encounter fierce shelling and gas attacks before finally being relieved and coming off the front line September 17th, which, after the battle, York was promoted to the rank of corporal. With the Battle of St. Mihiel becoming a large success for the Allies, they proceeded to keep up the momentum. The Allied forces began the Meuse-Argonne offensive on September 26th with the overall goal of capturing Sedan. As for the 82nd Division, they would be kept in reserve, finally being ordered to the front lines on October 5th. When the 2nd Battalion made their way to the front along the main access road, they were heavily attacked by German air and artillery. In the words of York,
We went out on the main road and lined up and started for the front, and the Germans was shelling the road and the airplanes was humming over our heads. We were stumbling over dead horses and dead men, and the shells were bursting all around us.
Eventually they would reach their frontline objective just south of Fleetsville. York and his men began to entrench themselves along the road at Châtel-Chery in preparation for their attack. Their objective was to capture Hill 223, then press on to capture the Decauville Railroad, which is a key supply railway for the German 2nd Landwehr Division. After capturing Hill 223 the day prior and repulsing a fierce German counterattack throughout the night, on the morning of October 8, 1918, Golf Company was to assault the railway after a 10-minute artillery barrage starting at 6 a.m. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, no artillery came, and the men were still forced to attack regardless. As Golf Company began to assault across the field, they covered 700 meters and met with no resistance. Then, in the matter of a second, thousands of rounds of machine gun and small arms fire began to engulf the American forces. In a 3-pronged defense of the valley, the Germans had managed to not only fire at the Americans head-on, but also hit them from both of their flanks, stopping the assault dead in its tracks. Minutes later, the U.S. troops began to take incoming German artillery fire and were forced to dig in. As the situation seemed dire, Sergeant Parsons ordered Corporals Early, Savage, York, and Cutting to take the remainder of their squads and work their way back down and around the German position. With only 17 men, they peeled off to their left flank. Utilizing as much microterrain as they could find, the patrol led by Corporal Early made it 300 meters ahead of friendly lines. The men were now in a good position and eager to flank the Germans from the left, but Early and York, both seeing this as unwise, made the executive decision to push on deeper into enemy lines and hit them from the rear. While crossing over the hill and down into the gully, they ran into 2 German medics. The patrol called for their surrender, but the medics quickly turned and ran. One of the privates attempted to kill the Germans, but he missed and they got away. As the patrol began to pursue these 2 men, they were led straight to the German headquarters. Almost instantly upon the Americans getting the jump on the position, 20 Germans threw up their arms and yelled, "Kamerad." As York recalled,
We jumped them right smart and covered them, and told them to throw their hands up and keep them up. And they did. I guess they thought the whole American army was in their rear, and we didn't stop to tell them anything different.
the Americans were now in a perfect position behind the German machine guns on the ridge. While attempting to round up the prisoners, multiple German machine gun teams had noticed what was going on behind their lines. As York recalls,
I don't know whether it was the German major, but one yelled something out in German that we couldn't understand. And then the machine guns on top opened fire on us. There were about 30 of them. They were commanding us from a hillside less than 30 yards away. They couldn't miss, and they didn't. They killed all of Savage's squad. They got all of mine but two. They wounded Cutting and killed two of his squad. And Early's squad was well back behind the brush on the extreme right, and not yet under direct fire from the machine guns, so they escaped. All except Early. He went down with 3 bullets in his body, and that left me in command. I was right out there in the open, and those machine guns were spitting fire and cutting down the undergrowth all around me, something awful. And the Germans were yelling orders? You never heard such a racket in all your life.
As the machine guns began to decimate the patrol, York and the remaining survivors found any little micro-terrain that they could use to take cover. Luckily for the men, they stayed close to the prisoners, and that forced the machine guns to shoot over their targets in order to not hit any friendlies. While under intense enemy fire, York began to single-handedly take out German after German, not missing a single shot. Suddenly, a German officer and 5 men jumped out of the trench and charged York with fixed bayonets. York quickly changed to his Colt 45, and just like hunting wild turkeys, he killed off the 6th man first, then the 5th, then the 4th, and so on. York wanted to keep him coming, as he was worried that if the Germans realized how accurate he was, they would just stop the charge and pump a volley into him. Immediately after this real-life John Wick moment, York turned to the German major, stuck his pistol in the officer's face, and told him to make him stop firing or he would take his head off next. The major, who could speak English, realized how clear York's negotiation tactics were, blew his command whistle, and just like that, about 60 Germans surrendered to York. As they were coming off the hill, they were dropping their rifles and gun belts, all except for one who attempted to throw a grenade at York. Luckily for York, the grenade exploded in the air and left him unscathed. Without hesitation, York shot and killed this resisting German and continued to round up the rest of the POWs. The 8-man patrol was now holding roughly 80 Germans. York, with his pistol pressed in the major's back, ordered the POWs to pick up the 3 wounded Americans and get in a column of 2s. They would step off directly towards the American front line. As they made their way, the column came under fire from German machine guns on the front line who realized the Americans. You see, the patrol had gone so far behind enemy lines that they captured the 2nd trench line and were now in the rear of the main enemy line. Instantly, York commanded the major to blow his whistle and have the men surrender. Without hesitation, the whistle was blown and the Germans threw down their arms. All except for one, who wouldn't stop firing, and that York had to kill as he couldn't afford to take any chances. With a total POW count of 132, and the enemy position now effectively captured, York and his patrol would walk the men back across no man's land and all the way to the regimental CP at Chat el-Sherit. After a quick reward of hot chow at the artillery kitchens, the 8-man patrol rushed back to link up with their unit and pressed on to their overall objective at the Decauville Railway. Their victory at the railway made it possible for the rescue of the infamous Lost Battalion. The next morning, York was ordered back to Hill 240 with the Salvage Corps to see if there were any still wounded Americans that had not yet been recovered. Upon returning to the site, York would later write,
The Salvage Corps was busy packing it up, and I noticed the bushes all around where I stood in my fight with the machine guns were all cut down. The bullets went over my head and on either side, but they never touched me. So you can see here in this case of mine where God helped me out. I had been living for God and working in the church some time before I come to the army, so I am a witness to the fact that God did help me out of that hard battle. For the bushes were all shot up around me, but I never got a scratch. So you can see that God will be with you if you only trust Him.
For this extremely heroic action, York would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross on February 11, 1919, that would later be bumped up to the Medal of Honor. Although York's actions were quite heroic, he remained humble and focused his energy on staying alive through the rest of the Argonne Offensive, eventually coming out on the other side on November 1, 1918, and would be promoted to sergeant the same day. Luckily for York and the rest of the men who endured the horrors of combat, the armistice would be signed 10 days later on November 11, 1918. Soon after the war, York would be ordered to remain in France to go on a massive PR tour around the country. While in Paris, York would be presented the Distinguished Service Cross by President Woodrow Wilson and the Croix de Guerre by Marshal Ferdinand Foch. In its entirety, the tour lasted over 4 months, and on May 22, 1919, York and the rest of his company made it home. Upon arriving, York was met with a parade in his honor, thrown by the people of New York and the Tennessee Society. They put him up in the Waldorf Hotel for 5 days and showed York all of the sights. He even got to meet the Secretary of the War Department and both houses of Congress. York appreciated all these accolades, but deep down all he could think about was getting home to Gracie and his family. Eventually, after receiving his discharge papers 4 days earlier, Alvin would finally make it home to Pall Mall on May 29, 1919. and just 8 days later he would marry his beloved Gracie. At the ceremony, thousands of well-wishers from Tennessee and the other surrounding states came in attendance. It wouldn't be long after the two were wed that Alvin would receive an abundance of offers for movies and books. Yet, Alvin felt that if he were to accept these offers, that he would be betraying the purpose of why he went to war in the first place. In his own words,
I knew that if I hadn't been to war and I hadn't been a doughboy, they never would have offered me anything. I also knew that I didn't go to war to make a heap or to go on stage or in the movies. I went there to help make peace, and there was peace now, so I didn't take the 30 pieces of silver and betray that old uniform of mine.
This personal response from York just made him even more adored by the American people. While he didn't strive to make any money, York did strive to make education a priority for his rural community. Being that Alvin was never allowed to finish school, he still found great importance in education. He wanted to give the next generation the life that he was unable to have. York's dream was to build many schools in Pall Mall and the surrounding mountain communities. He went on fundraising campaigns for buses, roads, textbooks, and so much more. But, after only receiving $10,000 in funds, and attempting to raise money by mortgaging his property, his dream of many schools would be forfeited for the practicality of having only one school instead. Alvin, seeing this as his only option, made a deal with the state of Tennessee for them to take control of the project. Fentress County and the state of Tennessee both agreed to the terms and offered up $50,000 each. In appreciation of all York's accomplishments, they would name the school the York Agricultural Institute and made him the honorary principal of the school. This being a great accomplishment for anyone just wasn't enough for Alvin. York continually felt compelled to do more. Alvin would go on to oversee and lead in the construction of roads, modern infrastructure, and even modern farming. As Hitler had just invaded Poland the year prior, in 1940, York would be approached by Warner Brothers to make a movie about his military accomplishments. Alvin, needing the money for his new Bible school, reluctantly agreed. He would join the cast on set as an official advisor to the film, knowing full well that the purpose of the film was not to tell his story, but more so to prepare Americans to get dragged into the inevitability of another war against Germany. Eventually, as the relevance of the Second World War came to fruition in America, York, being the old salt dog he was, attempted to re-enlist at the age of 54. But due to his diabetes, his age, and his weight, York was denied from service. Still determined to help the war effort, Alvin, at his own expense, went on numerous tours to give speeches to help raise money for the war effort. The military, seeing the enthusiasm of York, gave him the honorary rank of colonel. In a famous radio broadcast from Tennessee, he said,
Listen, please. We are fighting for life itself. Thou shalt not kill is written in the Bible. Here in America, we've always tried to follow that commandment. Our enemies have denied us the right to follow it.
After visiting the White House on multiple occasions and receiving a total of 50 awards, York would soon suffer 2 strokes and a cerebral hemorrhage that left him bedridden for the last 10 years of his life. Up until his death on September 2, 1964, Alvin would receive weekly visits from fellow veterans who wanted to meet their hero, even if it was just for a moment. Alvin has lived on throughout the years by his 8 children and his historic state park that you can still visit today. All in all, Alvin was a man with an unformidable background that managed to not only change his life, but also change the countless lives of others. Through his heroic actions on the battlefield, his commitment to education, and the unknown hours of painstaking work he did to improve all manner of life for anyone he met is just astounding. No matter the circumstances, Alvin's faith remained unwavering. He gave all the glory to the men beside him and his Lord and Savior. If we can learn anything today, it should be that no matter who you are or how many mistakes you've made, you can always go the extra mile to change your life and the lives of everyone you meet, regardless of the circumstances. With that being said, always remain faithful to whatever you hold near and dear to your heart, and I'll see you in the next one.
Initially, he was just a great grandfather. I mean, he was fantastic, jovial, kidded. He was just a great grandfather, what a typical great grandfather should be. His life definitely was an example, probably why I went in the military. He was a great role model. He was a great man. Character, morals, integrity, a great person. One to anybody would aspire to be like.